Thank you, Karen, for that very nice introduction. I'm glad you led with the fact I have some degrees from Stanford. I want you to know this is a friendly audience and a friendly speaker. I have a confession to make, which is that normally I teach undergraduates, and most of them were born during the Clinton administration. So it gives me particular joy to speak to a room where I am not the only one who lived during the Cold War. So I really want to welcome you back to campus, and you're welcome to come to my class winter quarter as well. Before I jump in, let me just say what an exciting time it is to be researching and teaching in international security here at Stanford. We are more interdisciplinary than we have ever been before. So one of the hats I wear as an administrator is co-directing the Center for International Security and Cooperation, which is just upstairs. And we are now moving into cybersecurity, bringing together faculty from computer science, from law, from political science, from history, to look at challenges in cybersecurity. The international security world is changing in some profound ways, and Stanford has been very innovative and adaptive, something that the intelligence community needs to learn a lesson from, in thinking about how to cross traditional boundaries to get some insight about how to think about these challenges and how to respond to these challenges. So my partner in crime, the science co-director at the Center for International Security, is a doctor named David Relman. He's an infectious diseases specialist. And so he has taught me that I am not an individual, but a host organism for a whole colony of things. And that I should be very, very afraid of things that I can't even see. So I'm happy to talk about some of the things that we're doing on the research side, on the teaching side, and on the policy side here at Stanford. But if you're an international security junkie like me, you should come back again as a Stanford undergraduate because it's a very exciting time. Now, I know you all didn't want to hear a lot about administration. You're here to learn about spies. Spies in TV, spies in the movies, and how realistic they are and how influential they are. So let me start by sharing with all of you a tale of two headquarters. Now, I know they call it classes without quizzes, but they lied. I'm going to ask just one quick quiz. Has anyone been to CIA headquarters before? Raise your hand if you've been. A handful of people. Okay. So for those of you who raise your hands, you know that the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia looks nothing like you'd think it would from the movies. There are no fancy retina scans or fingerprint devices, not even the iPhone 5s that have just come out where you put your fingerprint in to get the security code. It looks more like a post office. It has sort of a shabby 1970s bureaucratic building feel to it. So that's CIA headquarters. Now let me tell you about another center, another headquarters. It's called the National Counterterrorism Center, or NCTC. Now, NCTC was stood up shortly after 9/11. It's a relatively new intelligence agency designed to fuse terrorism threat reporting across different agencies of government. Now, NCTC does look like it came straight out of Hollywood. It does have the fancy screens and zinging graphics, and it does have that operations center feel that looks like it could come right out of 24 and Jack Bauer's CTU. And the reason it looks like it came straight out of Hollywood is that it did. The US government, you can't make this stuff up, the US government hired a team of Disney engineers to create the National Counterterrorism Center's operational headquarters to make it look like it should from the movies. And so this raises the question, is this art imitating life or is this life imitating art? Now, most people know deep down, that's a true story, right? Most people know deep down that real spying is different than what they see in entertainment. And I always put this slide up for my students, and they get the point right away. As one intelligence official put it to me. As one former senior intelligence official put it to me, most of us, you like that, most of us, he said, aren't as good looking as how we're portrayed in the movies. And none of us actually solve problems in 42 minutes or less. But the real question is, how different is real life from the movies, and why does it matter anyway? And that's what I want to talk about here today. So let me take a step back for a minute and talk about how much more important intelligence is in the current threat environment than it was during the Cold War. Now, this is a picture of Nikita Khrushchev banging his shoe at the United Nations Security Council, a sort of iconic image of the Cold War. During the Cold War, our biggest adversary, the Soviet Union, was easy to find and hard to kill, right? So the Soviet Union had territory on a map, they wore uniforms, they had embassies, they had offices. We knew who they were, we knew where they were, we knew they had nuclear weapons pointed at American cities. And so the first and last line of defense for American national security during the Cold War was firepower. Could we credibly threaten massive retaliation against the Soviets to prevent a nuclear war from ever starting? Today, it's the opposite. Today, our terrorist adversaries are hard to find and easy to kill, whether by human special forces or whether by lethal drones. So in today's international security threat environment, the first and last line of defense is no longer sheer military firepower, it's intelligence. The counterterrorism game is an intelligence game. In addition to that, we have a much more fluid threat environment than I would argue we've had in most of American history. Even after the end of the Cold War and that decade during the 90s, the threat environment wasn't nearly as dynamic, not nearly as fluid as it is today. Just to give you some sense of this, every year the Director of National Intelligence gives a public threat assessment to Congress, where he actually lays out what the threats are facing the United States. In the past 5 years alone, the Director of National Intelligence has listed 3 different #1 threats facing Americans: the global economic crisis, cybersecurity, and terrorism, a much more fluid threat environment. And when the threat environment is more fluid, intelligence becomes more important, because the role of intelligence is to reduce as much as we can uncertainty so that policymakers can make better decisions. And then finally, there are some sort of basics of the threat environment that are still wildly unclear. How many adversaries do we have today? What does it mean, Al-Qaeda and associated forces? Who are our adversaries? Is China a rising ally or a rising rival, for example? And what's the magnitude of threats that we face? How worried should we be about a critical infrastructure attack through cyber means? How worried should we be about pandemics, whether they be natural or man-made? Every day we're told to be afraid of something very different. And so in a world where the number and the identity and the magnitude of dangers that confront our national security are all more unclear, intelligence matters more. Right? So for all these reasons, I would argue intelligence is far more important today than it's even been historically, and yet most of us know very little about how this world actually works. Last time I checked, it could have gone up to a couple more, but the last time I checked, a couple years ago, only 2 members of Congress, 2 out of 535, had ever worked in an intelligence agency before. Now, if you compare that to members of the Armed Services Committees, typically about 1/3 of them have had prior military experience. So members of Congress that are critical in passing legislation about intelligence come with almost no prior experience from personal experience in the intelligence business. Universities are not educating policymakers and citizens of tomorrow either about intelligence topics. I looked at the top 25 universities ranked by US News and World Report in 2012. And I looked at their course catalogs to see how many of them taught courses on intelligence. And what I found was that only a handful did. Stanford is one of them. Twice as many universities in the top 25 offered courses about the history of rock and roll, which I tell my students means they have a better chance of learning about U2 the rock band than U2 the spy plane. Now, since 9/11, political scientists, and I'm a card-carrying political scientist, I have written about 2,000 articles in top academic journals on a host of topics. Of the 2,000 articles, only 3 have touched on intelligence topics since 9/11. So while policymakers have been grappling with NSA surveillance, targeted killing, interrogation techniques, most political science professors have been busy researching just about everything else. Now, in part, this lack of research has had to do with secrecy, right? The National Security Agency for years stood for no such agency, NSA. And I can talk a little bit about that. I was invited just a couple weeks ago, along with a handful of others, to actually go to the NSA. And I joke that when they call in the social scientists, you know they've really hit rock bottom. And so they're trying to figure out how to actually let outsiders in part to be able to educate others about what it is that they do. But the upshot of all of this is that when it comes to intelligence, facts are in short supply, but fiction is not. So let me give you an idea of what's happening with spytainment. In the past 15 or 20 years, the spy-themed entertainment industry has skyrocketed. Let me give you just a few examples. Books. Ludlum and Clancy together have sold more than 300 million books. That's about one for every American. Video games. In 2009, half of all adults and 97% of all teens played video games. And spy-themed games were top sellers among them, catapulting the industry from a $2 billion business in 1996 to a $16 billion industry just a couple years ago. TV. I looked at the Nielsen's top 100 ratings from the 1990s through the 2000s and found a 600% increase in the number of spy-themed television shows that made the Nielsen's top-rated shows from the 1990s to the current decade. And then, of course, there are movies. Since the year 2000, spy-themed movies had made the list of the top 10 grossing US films by box office sales every year since 2000. Today, the relationship between Hollywood and Washington is cozier than ever. The CIA actually does, can't make this up, pitch storylines on its website. The Pentagon has forward deployed to Los Angeles, where it has set up entertainment liaison offices there to work with Hollywood better to make movies. Catherine Bigelow and Mark Bowl, the director and the writer behind the movie Zero Dark 30, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, had better access to the operational details of the Osama bin Laden raid than most members of Congress or most intelligence officials. Now, don't get me wrong, I am married to someone who was a Hollywood screenwriter for many, many years. And I love getting transported to imaginary worlds where Congress actually works. and where spies all look like Daniel Craig, right? Who can argue with that? But my research has found that the blurring of fact and fiction has real policy consequences, and policy consequences that we haven't even fully grasped yet. And that's what I want to talk about. Tom Clancy once said, and I love this quote, "The difference between fact and fiction is that fiction has to make sense." The real world of intelligence is far more cloistered and far more complicated than what we see in the world of fiction. And so let me dig in a little bit to what I mean by that. I did a poll last year that started to get at questions about what do Americans know about intelligence? What are their opinions about critical issues like interrogation? And what are their entertainment viewing habits? It turns out no one had asked these questions before. So we fielded at Stanford a national poll through YouGov and The Economist, and did it last year, and I just got the same poll or similar poll back this week. So I'm going to share with you some of the numbers that we've been crunching that have not been public yet about the NSA. So that's my teaser for later. But let me start with baseline information, because I think it shows something that a nonpartisan intelligence science board concluded a few years ago, which is that entertainment has become adult education, and that most Americans actually don't know very much about how intelligence operates. Let me share, this is the question number one. And because it's classes really without quizzes, I've given you the answer, so I won't ask you the answer. So the question is, about what % of information in a typical intelligence report comes from secrets? Now the answer behind me, you'll see in bold, it's less than 25%. Most information, and in fact, the real answer is about 10%. So 90% of information in a typical intelligence report is from unclassified or open information that is put together with that document stolen from the Prime Minister's safe or that email that the NSA has intercepted. And it's the marriage of the secrets and the open source information that makes intelligence products so valuable. But this question, as you see at the bottom, if you ask it, it turns out that 93% of Americans, and it's a national representative sample of 1,000 people with a margin of error plus or minus 4 points, 93% either didn't know or got the answer wrong. This is a pretty basic understanding of the fact that intelligence agencies really aren't dealing very much with secrets, right? It's a part of what they do, but not a huge part of what they do. Here's a question I asked about the National Security Agency. What activities does the NSA do? Now, more people know the answer to this question this year than they did last year. So you'll see at the top, the answers are build spy satellites. That's not true. The NSA doesn't do that. But about a third of all Americans think that it does. The NSA does not interrogate detainees, but a third of all Americans think that it does. It does not conduct operations to kill or capture foreign terrorists. 28% of Americans last year thought that it did. It does, in fact, always has been a code-breaking agency. That was its raison d'etre when it was created in the 50s. It breaks codes and it makes codes that keep, say, our nuclear weapons safe, right? So the secured systems that guard our nuclear arsenal, NSA comes up with. Okay? It does, we now know much more than we did before, intercept phone and email communications. And I can talk about that more. And it does, in fact, analyze information. So I asked this same question this year, and let me just share with you a couple of the numbers that'll give you an idea of just how much we don't know as Americans about what the agency does. In terms of interrogating detainees, this year we asked if you didn't know at all. Before it was, did you believe yes or no? And now we ask yes, no, or don't know. Interrogating detainees, 77% of Americans either didn't know whether the NSA interrogated people or got it wrong, right? 3/4 of Americans. Similar numbers for the other ones on this chart that were not true. 3/4 of Americans actually don't know or get the answer wrong with the National Security Agency. So let me ask one that you can now use when you go to reunion parties and show what you learned from your class without a quiz today, which is about how many agencies are there in the US federal government involved in collecting or analyzing intelligence. Are there fewer than 4? Are there single digits? Is it around a dozen, or is it 15 to 20? The correct answer is 17 at the bottom, right? Probably a lot more than you might have imagined, right? Now, before 9/11, there were 12, and that number has gone up. There are a lot of agencies. Why do we care about this? This is not just a professor being professory, saying you don't know what we study in the academy. This simple fact about the number of intelligence agencies is really important because it suggests why coordination of intelligence was so bad before 9/11 and why intelligence reforms have still had trouble even after the deaths of 3,000 Americans on September 11th. It shines a light on just how important it is to think about interagency coordination in intelligence reform today. In my review of intelligence adaptation failures before 9/11, one of my conclusions is that coordination across agencies was a critical failing because there were so many agencies to coordinate. And if you buy the argument that coordination is a critical problem, creating more agencies after 9/11 to coordinate is probably not a move in the right direction. So the number of agencies matters for that kind of baseline understanding about what are the requirements for intelligence reform and how should we be thinking about that. Let me get back to my 2012 poll and give you some more interesting findings. So I asked about baseline understanding, and then I asked about people's attitudes towards torture, the hot button issue from last year. And I asked the question in the same way it was asked in 2007. Would you be willing or not willing to have the US government torture known terrorists if they know details about future terrorist attacks in the US? Now this question is loaded, right? They're known terrorists. They know about future terrorist attacks in the US, right? But look at the comparison over time. In 2007, the poll said 27% said they were willing to torture somebody under those conditions. In 2012, the percentage of those who said they were willing to use torture jumped to 41%. That's a gain of 14 points. At the same time, you see a decline of people who are unwilling to use torture. So when the question was asked of Americans in 2007, more than half of all Americans said they would not be willing to use torture under those circumstances. Same question asked in 2012, that had dropped to only about a third of all Americans, right? So a decline of 19 points. Americans, my polls find, don't just like the general idea of torture more now, they like specific torture techniques more now too. So I asked specific questions about specific techniques. And the best poll I could find during the Bush administration was in 2005, and it was fielded by USA Today, CNN, and Gallup, and they asked these questions about specific techniques. And so I used the exact same wording, right, because that's important when you're doing polling. Let me just run through the techniques briefly. You are a very brave crowd, I have to say, to come for your classes without quizzes to hear about waterboarding. So the first technique is waterboarding, which, as you probably know, is simulated drowning, where you strap someone to a board and you pour water through their mouth till the person feels as though they are really drowning. And it's supposed to be absolutely terrifying. The second technique is what's called stress positions. It's forcing prisoners to stay chained and naked in uncomfortable positions for several hours at a time. The third technique is rendition, or threatening to send someone to a third country like Egypt, where they're known more to engage in torture. Religious humiliation, there are some specifics with that question I'm happy to go into. Threatening a prisoner with dogs, and prolonged sleep deprivation. Now, there are a couple of really interesting things about all these numbers on the slide that you don't need to wallow in, but let me just highlight. You'll see that on the left-hand side, support for every technique from 2005 to 2012 went up, except for sleep deprivation. I don't know why, with sleep deprivation. So in the case of waterboarding, we have a jump of 9 points. That's well outside the margin of error. We have double-digit increases in support for naked chaining stress positions and rendition. The other really interesting thing about this chart is the other side, this side. Look at the dramatic decline in the number of people who say it's wrong, right? So waterboarding is wrong. 82% said waterboarding is wrong in 2005. 55% said it was wrong in 2012. Big double-digit declines in the percentage of Americans who think these specific techniques are wrong. So at the same time that we ended a lot of these practices from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, you see increasing public support for these techniques. And by the way, my latest poll just this week, I asked the question of general torture. The numbers have gone up still more. Support is rising, okay? So why do we see this? How can we explain why support is rising? There are a number of possible explanations. It could be that 2005 was a low point in sort of support for torture techniques. It was right after the Abu Ghraib scandal. It could be that people really hit their most anti-torture stance in 2005. And what we're really seeing now is the equilibrium point. That's one explanation. But I do think that the data suggest that media effects, the effects of spytainment, are a strong contender. Americans who said they frequently watch spy-themed TV shows or movies are significantly more likely than infrequent watchers, according to my polling, to approve of all of these techniques on this chart, except for threatening detainees with dogs. Again, some things you just don't know. So let me give you some examples. These are statistically significant results, and you can see the gap. I separated respondents into frequent spytainment watchers. Again, this is TV and movies, and infrequent watchers. And in some cases, I broke out the TV viewers from the movie viewers. Willing to assassinate terrorists, a 14-point gap between the frequent watchers of spytainment and the infrequent watchers of spytainment. Waterboarding is right, an 18-point gap. 38% of spytainment heavy watchers think waterboarding is right. 20% of infrequent watchers think that it's right. Rendition, this is transferring prisoners to a third country where they may engage in torture. Frequent TV spytainment watchers, 60% of them say that it's right, compared to 45% of infrequent watchers. A similar trend with moviegoers. Even naked chaining and stress positions. Frequent spy moviegoers favor that more than infrequent moviegoers. Again, all highly statistically significant findings. Now, as I often tell my students, correlation is not causation. These things are correlated, but it doesn't mean that television is necessarily causing these attitudes. It could be that people who like to watch Homeland or 24 are naturally more hawkish than the average Joe, and so there's no causal relationship between what they watch and what they think. Maybe they think the attitudes first and are drawn to this spy-themed entertainment as a result. That's possible, but I have my doubts. Entertainment, we know, has shifted popular culture on a number of other attitudes. Remember LA Law in the 1980s? Law school applications as a result of that hit TV show went through the roof in the 1980s. The Navy still talks about Top Gun as one of its best recruiting tools. And prosecutors have been bemoaning the CSI effect and saying that how the popular TV show has led jurors to expect fancy forensic evidence. And so prosecutors have to actually address that problem and explain why they don't have fancy forensic evidence in making their case in court. Before 9/11, research has found that torture was almost always depicted in TV and in the movies as something that the bad guys did. And after 9/11, that trend reversed. The Bush administration policies may be over, but their policies are more popular today than they have ever been. So that's, on the one hand, spytainment, I think there's evidence that it could be influencing public opinion, sort of mass attitudes. There's also some evidence that it's directly influencing policymakers as well. It's funny, I was just talking with a former intelligence official this morning. I was saying how I was going to be giving this talk, and I said, what do you think about spy-themed entertainment? And he said, well, policymakers watch the same shows that the rest of Americans watch. And so it affects what they think too. It absolutely does. But let me give you some at least anecdotal examples to make the point. In the fall of 2002, when interrogation techniques were first being discussed and brainstormed, a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Diane Beaver, who was the staff judge advocate general at Guantanamo Bay, where many of the detainees were being held, ran a series of brainstorming sessions about interrogation techniques. Jack Bauer, she later admitted, gave people lots of ideas. She later approved the use of dogs, sexual humiliation, waterboarding, and other controversial techniques. The dean of West Point, General Patrick Finnegan, was so concerned about the influence of the TV show 24 on his cadets and how it encouraged them to use torture and other techniques that violated their training and their rules, that he actually visited the creative crew of the show 24 to request that they make episodes where torture backfired. Now, and this was reported in the New Yorker, some of you may remember this, by Jane Mayer. In a Life is Stranger Than Fiction moment, the general came in his uniform, and everyone there thought he was someone for the set, that he wasn't really wearing his uniform, he was an actor. Human Rights First, which is a human rights group, was also so concerned about this that they teamed up with some Hollywood writers and producers and military educators to create a training video specifically for West Point cadets to teach them that they should not replicate what they see on TV and in the movies when they get deployed. They need to separate what's real from what's not. In 2009, Leon Panetta went to his confirmation hearing to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And he was asked by the Senate Intelligence Committee about a ticking time bomb scenario and what he would do if he were ever confronted with such a ticking time bomb scenario. Ticking time bomb scenarios are the ultimate Hollywood creation. They are not realistic. The Israelis say they're not realistic, American intelligence officials say they're not realistic, and yet here is the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence at a confirmation hearing of the CIA director nominee asking about ticking time bomb scenarios. And the nominee took the hypothetical seriously and said he would seek whatever additional authority he would need to get information that would protect Americans from imminent harm. The policy was quickly dubbed the Jack Bauer exception. Justice Antonin Scalia, this is not a Democrat or Republican thing. This is affecting policymakers and key officials on both sides of the aisle. Justice Scalia has suggested twice in public that he would turn to Jack Bauer to resolve legal questions about interrogation methods. More recently, we have an even greater blurring of the lines between fact and fiction. There was a movie that came out last year called Act of Valor. Some of you may have seen it. It used real Navy SEALs with their real Navy SEAL tactics in a totally fictionalized plotline. There was a TV show that was launched and canceled last year called Stars Earn Stripes. It was dubbed as a Survivor-like reality show hosted by former four-star General Wesley Clark, where sort of has-been celebrities went through combat training to see who would actually emerge victorious. And then there's the movie Zero Dark 30. Now, I could talk for a long time about Zero Dark 30, but I'll give you just a little bit, and we can save some more for Q&A. The opening frame of that film is unambiguous in its pretense to journalism. Here's what the opening frame of the film reads. Based on first-hand accounts of actual events, right? This isn't inspired by real events. Based on first-hand accounts of actual events. The director and writer of the film, Catherine Bigelow and Mark Bowl, went on a media blitz where they talked about it as a first draft of history and as a reported film. Their terms, not mine. The film is portrayed as a documentary-like account of the hunt for bin Laden, and it is nowhere close to the truth based on the best information there is from what's been unclassified from the intelligence record. Not in terms of the rescue operation, in terms of the role of specific intelligence techniques and the hunt for bin Laden. Let me be more specific. The film makes two key and factually incorrect assertions. The first assertion is that the nom de guerre, the sort of pseudonym of the bin Laden courier, was the key break that led to bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad. Okay? It was the nom de guerre of the courier that was the key piece of intelligence that led to bin Laden. The second key assertion of this film is that that nom de guerre came from a CIA detainee who opened up only after being softened up by torture. Right? No government official with access to the classified record has corroborated those two claims. And plenty with access to the classified record have flatly contradicted them, including former CIA Director Leon Panetta, former acting CIA Director Michael Morrell, and the current chairwoman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Dianne Feinstein. And if you want to read today's Washington Post, you can see buried toward the end of the story a little tidbit that bears on this question, because the story is about NSA and NSA's involvement in a drone strike of one of the guys who gave up the name of the bin Laden courier. And at the end of the article, it notes again that Senator Feinstein, talking on the basis of a 6,000-page voluminous classified report about the use of interrogation techniques, Senator Feinstein said that this particular person who was killed by a lethal drone strike gave up the name of the courier, the nom de guerre, before these interrogation techniques were used on him. That's a big difference, before or after. Right? So that's 0 dark 30. Now we come to Ed Snowden. The question is, are there media effects beyond just public support for torture? And the answer is maybe. It's too soon to tell. Again, as I mentioned, I just fielded this poll and we're still doing the statistical analyses, but I thought I'd share some of the hot off the presses findings that we have so far. And I've listed them here, and I'll give you some numbers behind them. I found 3 things. The first is that, again, looking at frequent Spytainment watchers, looking at movies and TV versus infrequent watchers, a statistically significant difference between the Spytainment watchers and others in terms of approval for the NSA phone and internet record collection program. Those who watch Spytainment are more likely to approve of these activities from the NSA. Spytainment watchers are more likely to believe that the NSA is telling the truth. They're also more likely to hold a favorable view of the NSA in pretty significant numbers. To give you some idea, people who say they watch spy TV frequently or occasionally, 43% of frequent watchers approve of the phone and internet record collection programs that have been revealed. 29% of infrequent watchers approve. Right? So that's a pretty significant gap of 14 points. In terms of believing the National Security Agency is telling the truth, by the way, more than half of all Americans think the NSA is not telling them the truth. But frequent watchers think the NSA is telling them the truth more than infrequent watchers. Right? So this is the beginning of an interesting, to me in any case, research program to look at what is the influence of entertainment both on what we know about these agencies and what we think about these agencies. The NSA is in the midst of the worst controversy in its organization's history. This is a time when public trust and accountability are essential for developing intelligence policies in a democratic society. And so understanding better the connection between fact and fiction in influencing public attitudes and policymaker beliefs and proclivities and policy proposals is going to be, I think, even more important in the future than it's been in the past. So as they say in the entertainment business, you'll just have to stay tuned. Let me stop there and open it up for questions.